Question 63. Lungs and pleura. The lung is the organ of respiration, and it has an apex, a base, and margins. The margins are the anterior margin. This is the left lung, so this would be anterior margin, posterior margin, and inferior margin. It has three surfaces: diaphragmatic surface, medial or mediastinal surface, which is this one, and then costal surface on the opposite side. Here you see costal surface into the costae or ribs. Now the mediastinal surface show a pulmonary hilum. Here the bronchus and vessels enter and exit the lung. You have the right hilum. You have bronchus, artery, and vein. So it's BAV. And in the left hilum you have artery, bronchus, and vein. ABV. Now you have on the mediastinal surface you have impressions of the mediastinal organs. On the left lung you have cardiac impression, impression of aortic arch, thoracic aorta, subclavian artery, and impression of esophagus. On the right lung you also have cardiac impression, impression of superior vena cava, brachiocephalic vein, subclavian artery, acygos vein, and esophagus. And on both lungs, near the apex, you would have impression of the first rib on the costal surface. Now the lungs are divided by fissures into lobes. The right lung is divided by oblique fissure and horizontal fissure into a superior, middle, and inferior lobe. The superior lobe has 3 segments, the middle lobe has 2 segments, and the inferior lobe has 5 segments. Here you have the 2 extra on the inside. The left lung is divided by oblique fissure into superior and inferior lobe. The superior lobe is divided into 4 to 5 segments, and the inferior lobe is divided into 5 segments. This is inferior lobe, this is superior lobe. This is superior, middle, and inferior. The pulmonary root joins the lung with heart and trachea and is composed of principal bronchus, pulmonary artery, pulmonary veins, bronchial arteries and veins, lymph vessels and nodes, and nerves. Here you have lymph nodes, left bronchial arteries of the left lung. Now the blood supply of the lungs comes from the bronchial arteries, from the aorta, and it exits in the bronchial veins to the acygos vein into the superior vena cava. The nerve supply of the lungs is by the thoracic ganglia, thoracic sympathetic ganglia, and from vagus nerve. And now lastly about the lungs, you have the projection on the skeleton. The apex extends about 4 to 5 centimeters above the anterior end of the first rib. or 2 centimeters above the clavicle. The inferior border of the lung, you have mid-clavicular line, then it ends around the 6th rib, then you have mid-axillary line, there it ends on the 8th rib approximately, and you have paravertebral line on the backside. Paravertebral, this is vertebral, so paravertebral is next to it, so the 11th rib or the 10th thoracic vertebrae. And now to look at the pleura of the lung. As you can see, it surrounds the entire lung, both sides. It is a serous membrane, and it consists of a visceral and parietal pleura. The visceral is also called pulmonary pleura and covers the surface of the lung and lines the fissures. You can see here it lines the fissures between the lobes. And the parietal, the green one, covers the walls of the thoracic cavity and mediastinum. And then you also have different parts of the parietal pleura. You have costal pleura on the costal surface. You have diaphragmatic pleura covering the diaphragm. You have mediastinal pleura between the mediastinal organs and the lungs. And cupula pleurae, or cervical pleura, that projects through the thoracic aperture. Now the parietal and visceral pulmonary pleura enclose the pleural cavity, which is only a narrow space containing a small amount of serous fluid. Right and left pleural cavities are entirely separated by mediastinum, and the costal pleura reflects into the diaphragmatic, forming costodiaphragmatic recess. This is the most inferiorly lying part of the pleural cavity. This is the costodiaphragmatic recess. This is the most inferior part of pleural cavity. And the costal pleura continues anteriorly into the mediastinal pleura to form costomediastinal recess. This one. Here you see costomediastinal recess. The uppermost part of pleura above the apex of lung is named cupula pleura or cervical pleura. So, which goes out with it. The parietal pleura, mediastinal, continues into visceral pulmonary pleura along the roots of the lung. So you can see here. Here you have the root of the lung. You have visceral and parietal. It continues. Now the inferior border of pleural cavity projects on the skeleton near the sternum on the 7th rib. And in mid-clavicular line, also on the 7th rib, mid-clavicular line. And in mid-axillary line, it crosses the 10th rib, and it ends at the level of the 12th rib in paravertebral line. Here. paravertebral line. This is that was the inferior border. Now the anterior border of pleural cavity is a line drawn from the cupola to the sternal angle. From the cupola to the sternal angle. And near the median plane to the 7th rib. Is above and below right and left pleural cavities. It borders superior interpleural area or thymic area and inferior interpleural area, pericardic area. Now the posterior border of pleural cavity is a line running near the vertebral bodies from the 12th thoracic to the 7th cervical vertebrae, and the cupola pleurae or cervical pleura projects through the superior thoracic aperture, extending about 5 cm above the first rib anteriorly and 2 cm above the clavicle.